It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Mark Twain. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. For tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. So, yesterday I mentioned that I was looking into this bill that comes out of California. I don't remember how much detail that I gave yesterday morning, but there's a bill out in California that's dealing with underaged prostitution, human trafficking. And there was some opposition to it. And it was kind of interesting because I saw a media clip from one of the committee meetings, and it just shows people objecting to it and kind of like their rationale for it. And then, of course, there was a lot of people that were like, "Oh, who would oppose this? Clearly only a pedo," and just like all these kind of comments. And I get it. Like, it's social media. That's what we do. We just take something, we run with it. We don't really put a lot of thought into digging down deep and saying, "Okay, what's going on here? What's the scoop?" Right? And sometimes we're right when we do that, and sometimes we're wrong. Basically, it's a crapshoot, right? But I was just curious because I was like, why? Why would you oppose this? In fact, let's just play the clip, and then we'll go through some information about this bill so that we get an understanding of what's going on here. And then I've got some, we don't need to tell you everything that's gonna, just get into it. Just go right into it. Get right in. Here we go. Is it playing? How
Harsher
about? Oh,
penalties
hold on.
proposed.
Let me back it up. There we
I
go.
believe that SB 1414 takes an overly punitive approach that fails to address the root causes of these issues and will not effectively stop sexual violence. We are particularly concerned that the harsher penalties proposed in this bill will disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
Okay, so that's what really got things going, is this notion that, hey, these harsher penalties are going to be applied to minority groups more so than others. And people were like, wait, what is that? What are you trying to say?
Especially members of the LGBTQ community, who already suffer from systematic biases within the criminal justice system.
And then that part right there, that's what blew up. I mean, I don't want to say it blew up the internet, but as far as this conversation is concerned, that's what blew up. Was like people were like, well, wait a minute. This is a bill to prevent sex trafficking of minors. Why would this disproportionately affect the LGBTQ community? It's a very good question, right? Like, what are you trying to say here? Now, I know what they're trying to say. They're trying to say, like, hey, there's these biases, and you add this new law, and and what they're saying is that it will disproportionately affect them, and not necessarily that they are disproportionately the perpetrators. So that's kind of how it was understood on social media. It was like, oh, so you're saying they're disproportionately the perpetrators. But what these advocates were actually saying is, it's disproportionately going to affect them because there's biases in the system that will basically lead to them being punished more than other people. But it's still unclear whether or not there's a proportional amount, like what's the representation for perpetrators, and that's not very clear. So it sounds terrible, rightly so, right? Let's continue listening.
Particularly when it comes to sexually based offenses. Studies have shown that LGBTQ people, particularly gay and transgendered individuals, are more likely to be charged with sex offenses compared to their heterosexual counterparts. For instance, LGBTQ individuals are 9 times more likely to be charged with sodomy. Measures like SB 1414 lead to higher rates of incarceration, longer sentences, and increased difficulties in finding housing and employment.
Today, EBC must strongly oppose Senate Bill 1414 for the reasons I will state. We stand against any punitive measure that perpetuates systemic injustices, and we emphasize instead the need for community-based solutions. We strongly support investments in victim services and programs to provide housing and other alternatives to help people escape trafficking. We are
So I want to point out here, that sounds all good and well, like that they want to have resources going for people that are escaping human trafficking. I get it. That makes sense. I would want resources, not necessarily government resources, but resources going toward that as well. The problem that she has here is that they're dealing with it after the fact. And this bill is trying to deal with it prior. So, what the bill is trying to do is basically remove the incentive or make the penalties for engaging in particular crimes so harsh that people would think twice and say, I'm not doing that because I don't want to go to jail. I don't want this. So that's what, so there's a mismatch already. The bill is trying to accomplish before the crime is committed. It's trying to deal with things before the crime is committed. And what she's talking about here, both of these women, the two women on the far right, the woman in the like the turquoise in the middle, she is the sponsor of the bill. That's Shannon Grove out of California. And then the two women to her left on the right side of the screen sitting there, they are opposing the they're not opposing the bill per se. We'll get into what's going on, why this kind of blew up and got really big. But their opposition is to say, like, look, we think that we should divert our resources elsewhere, instead of working toward harsher punishments. That's basically, so there's already a disconnect in where they're trying to solve the problem.
concerned that the harsher penalties contained in this bill will disproportionately impact marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown individuals who already bear the brunt of systemic biases within our criminal justice system. Under current California law, defendants could face years or even decades in prison for sexual violence committed against a minor, not just 6 months in jail, as Senator Grove and prosecutors have previously claimed. Furthermore, the approach outlined in SB 1414 diverts resources from vital programs and services aimed at supporting survivors of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, opting instead to increase funding for lengthy jail terms. Our research has shown that punitive measures such as lengthy incarceration and registries do little to prevent crime or protect communities. Instead, they perpetuate cycles of incarceration, exacerbating the very problems they are meant to address. Rather than investing in punitive measures, we should be investing in community-based solutions that address the underlying issues driving exploitation. We should instead support survivors in healing and rebuilding their lives with access to housing and funding for service providers. Given this, we respectfully urge you to oppose SB 1414. Thank you.
All right. So that was their opposition. Now, what's interesting is so when I did my deep dive, let me tell you what that deep dive included. I initially I saw this video, and it was actually a little bit longer video. There were a few people after that. They were just like onesies coming up, and they were just like, I'm so and so with such and such organization. I oppose, and so I just cut that part out. But I saw this video, and then I read all the comments, and at first I was like, yeah, like who would oppose this? Like that seems crazy, right? But I was just curious because I was like, well, is there any reason to oppose this? Because here on the Liberty Dad Show, when I look at a bill, I don't just say, "Wow, the intent of the bill, what the problem that you're trying to solve, thumbs up." Right? I want to look at what problem are you trying to solve? What are and how are you trying to solve it? Like, because I first want to know, is there a problem? That's the first thing I want to know. Because if there's no problem, then it seems then I'm starting to wonder, like, what is the impact of any bill going to be? Or if the problem is very, very small. And especially if it's very small, then it's possible that maybe we can deal with the problem without legislation. Maybe there's some other thing that we can do socially that will actually resolve, if it's a minor problem. So in this particular case, I had to start digging in. So it looks like I think it's KCRA 3. They did a very exhaustive. They made a documentary about sex trafficking in Sacramento. Apparently, there's like this 4 mile stretch of road called the Blade, and that's where a lot of sex trafficking occurs. Um, and so they did a really good job, and it was like a 46-minute video documentary. It was very sad. Link is in the show notes. I encourage you to go check it out and read about it. It was very fascinating, but at the same time, very it's very is there were some elements that were very sad to listen to and to watch. And then after that, I started digging into watching some of the hearings, so like the public committee hearings and the assembly meetings and stuff like that, because what I wanted to find out was like I wanted to know more about this opposition. And the woman that was in there with the mask, she's from a particular organization. I went to their website. I couldn't find any like formal statement from them, although she was reading basically on their behalf, and she was a representative for that organization. And it's an organization that it's like one of those local social organizations that helps out people. So what I was trying because what I wanted to know is like I wanted to go deeper than just, oh, so you're saying trans people want to come after our kids, right? I don't want to do that. I want to go. I want to dig in better because again, we're we're looking at a law here, and a law will punish people, and we want to make sure that we're punishing the right people for the right thing. We don't, and we want to make sure also that if we pass a bill, if we support a bill that's supposed to help out a particular group of people, like let's say we want to help out minors who are being sex trafficked, very admirable goal. We should be seeking out ways to correct this, to stop that problem. But if a bill doesn't actually solve that problem, then we may get legislators who pat themselves on the back and get to tell everybody what bill they passed, how it was totally going to help a bunch of victims, and then maybe it doesn't. So I couldn't help myself. I had to dig in deep, and so I read so many articles about this. I watched several hours of video, so that I could better understand. Now, I will say this, in the clip that I just played, they were asked specifically about some of their claims, and they didn't really have a good answer because they were asked, they were like, okay, well, you said study. What studies do you have? And they couldn't really point to one right away. I think they said something like, we'll get back with you, like we'll be happy to provide you information or whatever. So they didn't really have that information on hand. Um, at one point they were questioned about because if you remember in that clip, they said, you know, lengthy jail times don't solve this problem. Now, it might be true that it doesn't solve the problem, but what they were asked, they were like, well, and I think it was a detective or a former detective who was on the panel, the board. He was like, well, you know, my experience is that when somebody's being abused and their abuser is put in jail for a long time, they have a sense of relief. And he was like, flat out, he just said, my experience is different than what you're claiming here. Because they seem to be, and again, I think the disconnect is that these organizations are focused on people after the crime has already been committed. They're like, if you notice, they were talking about housing issues and reintegrating them back into life and all this. Like they're trying to rehabilitate people that have been through something. So they're basically on the after the fact end, the back end, if you will. And this law, again, as I mentioned earlier, it is trying to deal with beforehand. And I'm not making that up. If you go and read, Senator Grove has said on multiple occasions, she's like, we're trying to get the buyer. We're trying to stop the demand. Now I would argue that laws don't stop demand. All they do is increase the penalty for trying to meet that demand. So that's what laws do. And so the idea is, can you raise the punishment severe enough so that enough people will think twice about it? So if you think about it this way, if I run a red light, I'll probably get a fine, right? If a police officer sees me, pull me over, give me a fine, give me a ticket for running the red light. Um, if I run it really crazily in some manner, I might, maybe I get arrested on the spot at most. But that's basically the punishment. I'm basically going to get fined. So imagine if I ran a stoplight, and imagine if an officer could just shoot me on sight. Like that would lower because the penalty is so high, that would lower people that are willing to run a stoplight, right? It would probably have some other effects as well, but just to keep it simple, it would do something like so you can, in theory, raise the penalty so high that it pretty much stops. But the thing is, you can never get it high enough so that it stops everyone. And my analogy for that would be once upon a time, we heard that there were stories about this organization called the mob. Now, I'm not saying the mob exists, but I'm saying, like, if they did exist, we heard stories about this, right? And people would cross them. And in this fictional account of an organization that clearly never existed, they they were known to exact punishment quickly and harshly. Like you got found guilty and it was a done deal, right? And so you had fewer people that were willing to cross them. Well, the same thing happens in our legal system. You can make the punishment if the punishment for murder is shoot on sight, fewer people are going to be willing to commit murder, right? But if the punishment for murder is, hey, we're going to send you a nasty letter, then you might have an increase on some level, right? Like there's going to be because like why not? Like punishment for it is not so harsh, so whatever, right? So you would see it happen more frequently. So I don't disagree with the idea necessarily that we should pass bills that go after the buyer, but I do think that there's a limited amount of return to expect on that, if much one at all. So that's what's going on. The other thing that's going on in in that particular video clip that's not very clear, and this is what caused the whole problem, and this is why it all got like it got so much attention. So Shannon Grove, out of California, proposed this bill, and as it was going through different committee meetings, it went to the Public Safety Committee meeting, and she was, and you could go watch the video if you really were, bored. But in that, that's where these three amendments occurred, and these three amendments, as she says, they were hostile amendments. Okay, so the amendments, and she calls them the Force Committee amendments, and so I'm reading it here from her website in this post that she made dated on May 23rd. She said forced committee amendments soliciting or buying children 15 and under for sex can only be charged as a wobbler, which that means either a misdemeanor or a felony. If it's a misdemeanor, then it's punishable by a minimum of 2 days in jail or a fine or both. So the wobbler portion of it is it goes from being a felony period to this wobbler, which means like, okay, in some cases, maybe you get charged with the misdemeanor. In some cases, you get charged with the felony. And so that's basically up to the court. And then buying a 16 or 17-year-old is only punishable as a misdemeanor. Okay, so that was that was the First Amendment. That was a pretty big one. The Second Amendment was that the felony charge only carries possible jail time, not prison. So you don't go to prison, you just go to jail. And then the third one, only perpetrators with a previous conviction of purchasing sex from a child 15 or under on the second offense, and then with a 10-year age gap to the victim, has to register as a tier 1 sex offender. So, run through that one more time. First, the First Amendment to this bill said only 15 or under um, Soliciting or buying a child 15 or under for sex is only is a wobbler. So maybe it's a misdemeanor, maybe it's a felony, depending on the situation. 16 and 17 off the table. You can only be punished by purchasing them as a misdemeanor. The felony charge, then you'll only go to jail, and then you only have to register as a sex offender if you're 10 years old or older, and the person that you paid sex for was 15 or under. So this seems pretty substantial. So this is what made the news. So the video in question that we watched a moment ago, what that is, that was another committee hearing to consider reversing these amendments. And so they were opposed to reversing the amendments. It wasn't clear whether they're opposed to the bill entirely, just rolling it back, because that's what was going on. And then um and then Ms. Grove and others were there to say, "Hey, please return, pass my bill as it was originally, not with these amendments that came out of the Public Safety Committee meeting." Right. So this is what made the big headlines. This is what caused all the problems. So what I want to do is I want to go through this Reason article about the bill, and we're going to learn a little bit more, because there was actually quite a bit of information that I dug into, in the process of looking into this bill. But I will play this video clip real quick. It's like 2 minutes. It's from KCRA, and it kind of goes over some more details of the bill. Maybe I'll play it.
And today at the state capitol, an effort to increase the penalties for people who purchase a child for sex had its first hearing.
And while the bill passed out of its committee, its author is not very happy right now. KCRA3's Ty Still joins us now to walk us through what happened, Ty.
Yeah, this is making national headlines right now. An adult soliciting a minor for sex in California is a misdemeanor. Senate Bill 1440 would make it a felony. The author of the bill is Republican State Senator Shannon Grove. The original proposed law would make it a felony for anyone who solicits sex from a minor. The proposed punishment would be up to 4 years in prison and up to a $25,000 fine.
Okay, so this was the bill in its original form. So this is what's going on now. I want to point out that when we're talking about this bill, there is a bit of history going on with the idea of prostitution and sex trafficking in California. So a while back, they passed SB 1322 that decriminalized prostitution for children under the age of 18. And I'm reading this. The law looks at teenagers as victims rather than sex workers, and allows cases for minors to be placed in civil protective custody. So in other words, they're not going to punish you if you're a minor for being sex trafficked, because the law looks at it and says you're actually the victim. And I agree with that. Now, in the course of all my studying, what I came across is that apparently that did cause some unintended consequences. And so it wasn't clear exactly what it was. I didn't keep digging in, but this kind of helped move things along, because in the next thing that happened, and that was back in like 2016. So then the next thing is that SB 357 was passed, and that no longer makes it illegal to loiter for prostitution, authorizes someone convicted of loitering for prostitution to petition the court to dismiss and seal case and get resentenced. I don't know much about that particular bill, but again, this is just the chain of events that have occurred. And so then we get SB 14, just 14, which makes it a serious felony for anyone to sell a minor for sex. A serious felony carries more prison time and a strike as part of California's 3 strikes law. So what they did was they went after the seller, okay, in SB 14. So then Senator Grove was the one that authored SB 14. There's an interesting history behind that. But then after that, then we get SB 1414, which would make it a felony to purchase a minor for sex. So what Representative Grove was trying to accomplish was say, we're going to go after the buyer now. So the way California worked it, they decriminalized prostitution for those under the age of 18, looking at it as, hey, you're a victim, not a criminal here. Good. That's a good thing. Then they passed a bill that would go after the seller, and I'm skipping the one about loitering for prostitution. I mean, I that seems, if you're starting to decriminalize it, you should probably not make it illegal to loiter for prostitution. If you're underage and you're a victim, and if you're of age, well, you're not necessarily a victim, though you might be, but you might be working at your own free will, and as a libertarian, that should be permissible. So I don't have any issues off the cuff for that particular bill, but I didn't really read it. And I actually didn't read any of the other bills other than 1414. Then we go and we say, all right, we're gonna go after the seller. Good thing. And then now they're like, all right, let's go after the buyer. And so now that's what having a big fight about is like, okay, how do we go after the buyer? Who's the buyer? And some people were concerned. And so they're like, well, this is going to hit marginalized communities more. And then people on the internet were like, oh, so marginalized communities, are they the ones that are committing all these extra crimes? Kind of, sort of, but not really. Okay. So that's where we are. Let me read. I'm going to pull up on the screen as well. Oh, we got to finish the video. I'm sorry. Hold on.
Grove also proposes to have the buyers register as sex offenders for 10 years. The bill was in a hearing before the Senate Public Committee, and there was a disagreement on some of the language of the bill. Grove rejected the amendments. Those amendments make it so that the law does not apply to those who buy a 16 or 17-year-old for sex, and it would only apply if the victim was 15 or younger, and the most severe penalties only apply to adults.
This bill goes well beyond human trafficking, and I think human trafficking, we should be throwing the book at people. This bill will sweep in a lot of people who are not trafficking. This bill will send people to state prison, put people in the sex offender registry, which is basically effectively, in many ways, the end of their life for people, whether or not they're engaged in human trafficking. And again, even if there's no physical contact whatsoever.
To water this down to say that 16, 17-year-olds don't matter, that them being, and it's not just about human trafficking, and I think that's the disconnect. I believe that human trafficking is anything that is forcing someone to do something against their will. This buyer situation is a random person driving down the road, seeing a kid that looks like they're 12 or 13 and say, hey, $50 for this. That's the guy I want to go after.
Now, despite the objection by Senator Grove, who you just heard from there, the committee approved the bill with the amendments by a vote of 4-0. It now heads to the Senate Appropriations Committee.
All right. So that's what's going on. That's the good history of the bill. So now let's kind of read some of these arguments. So I'm going to pull up this Reason article, which, people in my community, they give Reason magazine a hard time, and kind of rightfully so. I don't think that they really did it. I kind of disagree with the approach that they took in this particular article. I don't think it addressed it very well. But let's pull it up and let's go through it here. So here is the article. California Democrats water down sex trafficking bill. Good. Okay. Okay. Well, let's see what the argument is, because from where I stand, watering down the bill doesn't seem like a good thing, right? But we'll get into that. All right. California Democrats are taking heat for watering down a child sex trafficking bill. But as anyone whose brain isn't completely broken by politics might imagine, this isn't a case of lawmakers trying to make life easy for people who abuse and exploit children. I agree. That's not the case of it. Okay. They're just trying to insert a smidge of sanity into the bill's punishment schemes. The scorn with which this has been met underscores how hard it is for legislators to push back against policies that are purportedly about protecting children. The measure in question, Senate Bill 1414, was introduced in April by State Senator Shannon Grove, Ann Caballero, Susan Rubio, and it would raise the penalties for soliciting a minor for prostitution. It passed the Senate in a 36-0 vote in May after being amended somewhat from its original form. It passed out of the Assembly Public Safety Committee in an 8-4 vote last week after another amendment was added. The amended bill now goes to the Assembly Appropriations Committee. It's these amendments that have some, including Grove, up in arms. The amendments. Under current California law, soliciting someone an offender knows or reasonably should know is a minor for prostitution is a misdemeanor, punishable by mandatory minimum imprisonment of 2 days in county jail and a possible punishment of up to 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine. As introduced, the bill would have raised the offense to a felony and the punishment up to a possible 4 years in state prison and a fine of $25,000, regardless of whether defendants knew or should have known the person was a minor, and regardless of whether defendants were themselves above the age of 18. It also includes sex offender registration requirements. The original version had no mens rea component for applying enhanced penalties. That is, it didn't matter if the person charged had no reason to believe the person solicited was under the age of 18, and it had no exceptions for when the person doing the soliciting was also a minor. So I think those are important issues to bring up, those two items right there. Because what happens if a 17-year-old pays a 16-year-old for sex? Well, that 17-year-old is now going to prison, or they would have been, it would have been a felony. They would have went to prison, and they would have been a sex offender. I think it's a fair argument to say a 17-year-old buying sex from a 16-year-old is much different than, say, a 20-year-old buying sex from, like, say, a 15-year-old, to make it a little bit more, to make the point a little bit better there. So, I think these are good things to bring up, but that's not what was really brought up by the advocates in the video. They're just saying, like, "Hey, this is going to impact marginalized community." It seems like that almost seems like a buzzword when people want to argue something, like this is going to hurt marginalized communities. Okay. Just it almost feels like just like this knee jerk response. Like people don't even really think about it. There's like, oh, marginalized communities can't support that bill. And I think they need to come up with better arguments. But this would be one. And then it had no exceptions for the I'm sorry. And then it didn't matter if the person charged had no reason to believe the person solicited was under the age of 18. I think that would be kind of fair. Depending, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's a way to craft the law where you can say, hey, look, up until a certain age, like if the victim is 15 or under, then we don't care whether you knew or not. But if the victim is 16 or 17, then, we'll look into whether or not you should have reasonably known that. Something along that line. Because look, if you're 17 and you're getting ready to turn 18, let's say I'm 17 on Monday and I turn 18 on Saturday, and somebody meets me and I say, I'm 18. They have no reasonable way of knowing that I'm only 18 in the next 5 days, right? And I'm going to look basically the same. In fact, I will look basically the same in 6 months. So I think there's a certain fairness in considering that and saying, okay, well, should they have reasonably known? There is some sort of, I do believe that, I don't know what the age is, but we should consider, like, there's an age at which we're just going to say that we're drawing the line here, and it doesn't matter whether you could have reasonably known, right? You should have, and if you didn't, that boo-hoo, right? Like, that's fine. I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere, right? There'll always be that edge case. There's always that 15-year-old that totally looks like they're 12, and then there's that 15-year-old that looks like they're 18, but you draw the line anyway, right? Like, that's how it works. Same thing with 18. We know that, hey, there are some 18-year-olds that can go out and they can make 18-year-old decisions, and there are some, 25-year-olds that go out and they cannot make an 18-year-old decision, right? Like we know that, but we draw a line anyway. So I think it would have been useful to draw a line and say, okay, here at this point, this is where we're going to make that distinction. All right. So continuing on, under the amended versions of SB 1414, solicitation of a minor would sometimes be a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in county jail, and sometimes be a felony punishable up to 3 years in county jail. The stronger punishment would be available only when the defendant was 18 or older and knew or should have known that the person was solicited, who is solicited, was a minor at the time of the offense. And it would only apply when the solicited minor was under 16 years of age at the time of the offense, or if the person solicited was under 18 years of age at the time of the offense and the person solicited was a victim of human trafficking. So there's a lot going on there. A second or subsequent offense would always be a felony, and a offender more than 10 years older than the solicited minor would have to register as a sex offender for 10 years. I actually don't agree with that part. I don't agree that it should be limited to 10 years or older, because you're talking about, say, a 25-year-old, um, or let's go with 24. A 24-year-old could solicit sex with a 15-year-old. That's only 9-year difference, right? And then they wouldn't have to be a sex offender. But I'm like, if you're 24 and they're 15, you're a sex offender, period. Okay. And we're going to get into the issues of whether or not it's really consenting in the first place. Okay. Because um, I think that matters. If you're no, and what I mean is in terms of sentencing and in terms of how harsh we come down upon you, right? If you do something and the person was consenting, that's different than if you do something and the person was not even consenting in the first place, right? So there's a different egregiousness in that. Okay, that's all I'm saying there. Okay, so I would say they need to tighten that up a little bit, like maybe 5 years, especially since they kicked out 16 and 17-year-olds. So I think 5 years would have been, much more reasonable to say, okay, like, look, if they're 15 and you're 20, yeah, you should have, you're going to be a sex offender. If you're 19, I'm not comfortable with it, but it's at least the person is a lot closer, right? Because you kind of get into the Romeo and Juliet laws when you get people that are getting closer in age. And so that's all we're trying to satisfy for, is make sure that, hey, when there are people, like if I could have went to school with somebody, I don't want to say me, if a person could have went to school with somebody, if they could have been in the same high school, then I don't really think it's appropriate to necessarily call them a sex offender if both people were willing participants, right? Like that doesn't seem to me to be appropriate because they're so close in age. So that's all we want to. This is the kind of criticism that we need to have. When we see these kind of media clips, we got to do more than just chortle and be like, I knew it. Those transgender LGBTQI plus whatever folk, they're all a bunch of pedos. Like that makes great, I guess, for clicks and likes on the internet. But back in the real world, when we're actually going to start punishing people, we want to make sure that we spend time looking at our laws. And from what I could tell on social media, nobody really did that. Nobody really dug in. And then you don't have to dig into to the level that I did. I did it because I wanted to be able to come and speak coherently and, be very familiar with the topic. And I was just curious about certain things. All right, continuing on. Note that nothing in the bill, as introduced or amended, would change penalties for people who force or coerce minors into prostitution, nor would it affect the laws surrounding sexual activity with a minor. This is about solicitation, which is essentially a speech crime, the asking about sexual activity or offering of money for sex. I'm not really sure this is where I have a big problem with reason. A speech crime? Like let's look at it from a different angle. Think of it as I am threatening you. There's what you call a true threat, and then you're like, okay, this is not a true threat, right? There are legal standards for when something is considered a threat, right? Like if I call you up and I say, I heard you did this thing. I will be at your house in 20 minutes. I'm bringing my gun and things are going down. You're going to be sorry. And then I hang up the phone. That's a threat. And that I should be punished for that threat, because now you have to figure out, do I call the police? Do I board up my home? Do I leave my home? What's the situation? Right? Like now now you're being forced in a sense to deal with whether or not I may come over and bring bodily harm, and cause bodily harm to you or your family or whoever's there. Right. But if I were to get online and I were to say something like, man, I hope you fall down the stairs. Okay. That's not a threat. It's not a nice thing to say, but it's not a threat. So they're entirely different categories of speech based on the presumption of what is to follow. In this particular case, I disagree with reason by saying like, oh, it's a speech. It's not like somebody just made a joke, an inappropriate joke about child sex workers. Okay. That would be like a speech issue, again, unpleasant and crude, but at least it is within speech. They're not necessarily intending to do anything. But in this particular case, like solicitation is exactly that. It's not just like some casual speech. You're like, you don't walk up to somebody and just casually be like, yeah, can I offer you $50 for your time intimately? Right. Like that's not like that is an actual request that is in my mind very similar to threatening somebody and saying, hey, will you yeah, I will come over and harm you. It's basically expressing intent. And so now the other person has to make a decision based on that intent. So I don't I think Reason kind of made a big mistake here because Reason's, they're supposed to be the libertarian magazine, but ish sometimes. But anyway, it's a topic for another day. All right. The bill does not require physical contact or sexual contact with the minor victim, according to the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. There are already felony crimes associated with actual lewd or sexual contact with a minor. So again, I get that. Now, if you wanted to say, look, for the act of solicitation itself, just asking, we're not going to send you to jail for 10 years. I mean, I guess if you want to make the penalty a little bit lower and say, look, if you get caught before the actual action, then here's one penalty. But then if that solicitation actually leads to action or leads to what would be action if like it's a sting operation, then now you're going to be really punished. It's kind of like the same as if I were to say, "Hey man, can I sell you some drugs?" and you happen to be a police officer undercover and you're like, "Yeah, let's meet up later." And then I don't show up. Well, that's different, right? Like there's two different things going on there. One is just me asking, which kind of does show intent. The other one says now he's shown intent and he showed up to make this happen. So I think it would be fair to say, all right, we're gonna distinguish between just the act of asking and then the act of asking that leads to a situation where follow through can happen. Right? This is how we should be evaluating bills because we're literally going to punish people. And their complaint about punishing people, like there is a legitimacy to being concerned about punishments that we inflict on our fellow citizens. We should make sure that we're punishing people when we absolutely have to, and for no other reason than we absolutely have to, right? We want to make sure that we don't have this drag net that just kind of swoops over and catches a bunch of people and punishes them in the most harsh manner, because it's not always clear whether that will actually even solve the problem in the first place. Okay, you can drive things further underground and then things actually will get worse. So you may not actually be helping people. So we can't just think, oh, the harshest penalty, that's the one we want. We have to think these through. We have to start asking these questions. I just don't think that Reason did a really good job. All right. The controversy, the amendments to SB 1414 have drawn criticism from Grove and others who claim the bill will now make it too hard to punish sex criminals. In reality, the amended bill simply allows punishments to be more tailored to circumstances. Okay, I agree with the idea. Yes, we should tailor things to circumstances, but they should not be too tailored, right? Like we just have to make sure we think these through. The amended bill would make it harder to punish everyone in a blanket way, but in a free society, we should consider that a good thing. Okay, so I agree and I disagree. I don't think that Reason here, and we'll see. I think we're almost done with the article. They didn't really go through and say, here is a better approach for dealing with this bill. They just kind of said, yeah, it's a good thing they watered it down. We should limit. We shouldn't do things in a blanket way. Okay, well that's not comforting because we are talking about 15-year-olds and younger and 16 and 17-year-olds potentially being trafficked. Like, this isn't even something as simple as like teenagers just doing their thing. This is literally talking about adults taking advantage of children. So I think we can do better than just it's a good thing we don't we don't punish everybody in a blanket way. Like, that's just a very lazy argument. The heat that those amending the bill have taken shows a wider problem in our criminal justice system. Actually, it really doesn't, but okay. In which allowing for any nuance gets slammed as weak and inexcusable. Okay, that's that's not really a problem in our criminal justice system. That's a social problem, and there is some truth there. Like, people don't like nuance. Like, you try to you try to add nuance, and then people will be like, oh yeah, but what about this? And they'll come up with some crazy extreme example to make you sound like a lunatic. Right. But there's nothing weak about realizing that specific circumstances do matter, and that a one size fits all solution to law enforcement is likely to overpunish and over incarcerate. Again, I agree, but you need to make a better argument. You can't, because if you just say that about somebody stealing candy bars from the store, people aren't going to be as outraged about it. But when we're talking about adults taking advantage of minors who are in a situation that maybe they don't even want to be in, on top of that, right? Like, then things are a little bit more sensitive. And so then we need to make a better case. Reason. Anyway, I'm not even here to argue against reason. I'm just using them because, like, whatever. It takes courage to craft criminal justice solutions that are both fair that are fair both to victims and to those accused of crimes. Whether this amended bill gets that balance right is up for debate, but it's really at least attempting to grapple with gray areas. Kind of. Under the amended version, adult defendants who brazenly solicit minors for sex can receive a more extreme punishment. But defendants who are minors themselves, are barely older than 18, or have no reason to know the person in question is a minor, may receive a lesser sentence. Punishments can be tailored to the circumstances. What's so bad about that? Well, there's nothing really bad necessarily about tailoring them, but if you tailor them too much, then again, you're on the opposite end. You may not be solving the problem anyway, right? Because we have to know, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? So let's take a look. So what was interesting is there was an article from KCRA. It's a long article. I've got it linked in the show notes. And that article goes very far it goes really in depth. Okay. It digs down deep, and it comes with a video that you can watch. And they have a link to a study. And this study was very interesting. It was from 2022, and it's titled Estimating Sex Trafficking in Sacramento County, Final Report. And I was like, oh, hey, wow. And it's like a 90-some page study, which I dug into. Okay. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole thing. We're just going to kind of go and show you a couple interesting points that I thought were useful. Let's see. Where are we here? There we go. Nope, we want to do this. How about there? There we are. Okay. So here is the study. I'm not going to go through and try to read you gobs and gobs of this, but I do want to point out a couple of things, because what we want to do with a bill like this, yeah, we can have our fun and laugh about it on social media and get some clicks out of it. But then, as responsible citizens, we should be digging in and saying, okay, is the bill even good? Now, it's possible that the bill is not a good bill, and that the critics of the bill are wrong in their criticisms, right? Like, two things can be those two things can happen at the same time. They could be criticizing it for the wrong things, and the bill still not be good, or the bill could be great and they could be praising it for the wrong things, and all various manner of situations in between that. Okay. So what I thought was interesting from this bill comes over on page 8. So we'll go down here, and they say the purpose of this study is to estimate the prevalence of sex trafficking exploitation among adults who trade or sell sex in Sacramento County. Additionally, this study is intended to better understand the nature and the scope of sex trafficking in Sacramento County, and to collect data capable of informing a strategic, coordinated, multi-system response to sex trafficking that can be useful for both prevention and intervention efforts. Now, I do think there's something to be said here. Prevention and intervention efforts, right? So I think when we're looking at bills, we should think, okay, like, is this bill going to actually prevent it? Now, I don't think any bill will always prevent something. There will always be somebody willing to risk it. I mean, going back to the issue of the mob, right? Like there were people that were willing to try their hand at getting one over on the mob. So there's no reason to believe that we could ever craft a law that's so strict that it removes down to zero. The question is, to what extent will it get it down? And this is where you have to find the balance. What extent will it bring the problem down, right? Versus what number of people will be potentially caught up that didn't need to be caught up? Because if you make the bill so strong, if you're like, look, if you even think about this, right, then you're going to jail and you could be on the sex registry, right? Like if we have access to people's brains and what they could think, if you even think about it, well, all of a sudden you're just going to get piles and piles of people that are in jail. But if you lower that and you say, okay, if you think about it, we're not going to punish you in jail. Even though we have access to your thoughts, we're not going to punish you. But if you talk about it, we will, right? That reduces the number of people. So you've got to find that balance. And I think that when we talk about bills and legislation, we should really be thinking about, okay, how do we prevent it? How do we intervene? And then, of course, what about people after the fact, right? If you've got victims, how are we dealing with the victims after that? And all three of those are different points in time that require different strategies, because you've got maybe somebody that's coming out of this element and they never wanted to be there in the first place. So, and if they've been in there long enough, then it makes it very difficult for them to not go back. And so we want to make sure that whatever strategy we have for dealing with, people that have come out of these kind of situations, we need to make sure that we are prepared to help them so they don't go back. And then if they're currently in that situation, then we need a strategy that's going to say, all right, how do we find them and how do we get them out permanently, right? And then how do we prevent people from getting in that situation in the first place? And so that's what this bill is basically trying to do. The legislators are trying to balance, like they're trying to say, we're going after the seller, we're going after the buyer, we're going after all these people. And by doing that, we're going to stop the problem. Now, I think there's a limitation on that comes very quickly. If you just, because again, if you're not thinking about how you're going after these people, then you might end up with a dragnet that overdoes it. But I think the argument, well, this will affect, minority communities. Well, let's take a look at this next page here. We'll go there. Let's see, prevalence estimates. Okay. So they estimated in here that there were between 2015 and 2020, there were 13,000 people that were being victimized. But then it goes on to say, let me pull this up a little higher. This does not mean 13,000 individuals are currently being victimized. It is also important to note that the length of time that victims were trafficked varies, such that some may have been trafficked for a couple of days during this period and others for the entire 6-year period, 6-year data collection period. Because of the variation in length of trafficking exploitation, we cannot use this estimate to determine the number of victims in a single year or day. So again, this is part of understanding the problem. If you don't understand the problem, you will in no way be able to craft any kind of legislation or solution, if it doesn't include legislation, that will address it correctly. So we have to understand. So then it's this very last one that I thought was very interesting, which gets to the heart of the demographics. So it says the mean age at the time of the interview was 36. So when they interviewed people, the middle age, the dead square middle, was 36, and in the range of people that they interviewed were between 18 and 64. So they're interviewing adults and they're talking about like, hey, tell us about your experience. The mean age when participants first sold or traded sex was 20, with a range from 1 to 49. That just sounds gross. That sounds absolutely disgusting. This wide range of entry age, this wide range of entry ages adds to the literature challenging the prominent myth that the average age of entry to sex work is 12 to 14 years. So for the longest time, there has been this argument that the average age of work, that people that are getting into sex work start at 12 to 14. But as it turns out, when they interview people as adults and say, when did you enter in? They find that the mean age was 20. And so, like, how many are above or below that is the question, right? And so this is important to know because we're having this big argument and we're criticizing people, because we're like, oh, well, just like like some of the comments, like just like I knew, the trans folk or the LGBT folk, they just want to go after our children. Well, if the mean age is 20, then how many are under 20? How many, more importantly, are under 18? Or how many are 15 or under, right? If we're going to say, okay, well, maybe the 16 and 17-year-olds, or even just a 17-year-old is pretty close to 18. So we'll allow for a wobbler effect there, where maybe it's a misdemeanor, maybe it's a felony, because the ages are so close, right? Or some other mitigating circumstances, you know, but again, the question is how many are under that age for which you're not going to have any tolerance? That's the big question. And that doesn't seem to be there in the answer. Like I wasn't able to find it. And this is the best that we could find. So the question is, are we actually going to solve a problem or not? Well, let's pull up. So this document here is 93 pages and it references some other studies. So let's pull up something else and see what we find, because I think you're going to see, oops, did I make a mistake? What did I do there? I think we'll be good with that. Okay. So we're going to go back to the internet here and we're going to look at something. Now I want to point out a couple articles here and we're just going to go through them really quickly. All right. So this actually comes from The Atlantic. And I'm going to go up here. This is an article titled, "Is One of the Most Cited Statistics About Sex Work Wrong? Prostitutes don't in actuality start on average at age 13, and insisting that they do misrepresents them." This is from 2014. So this is a bit of an old article. So we go down here to this is the important part that we're going to read. "Even by mathematical standards, the numbers don't add up. In order for 12 or 13 to represent the national average age of entry, there would need to be a significant number who enter at ages younger than that. The vast majority of young people who are rescued by law enforcement during Operation Cross Country Sweeps are 16 and 17-year-olds," Koyama says. "And there are rarely any under the age of 13. For the average age to be around 13, there needs to be many more 5 to 12-year-olds that are forced into prostitution than are empirically plausible. If the massive numbers of children exist in quantities enough to offset those who enter in their late teens or as adults, they're not showing up in the arrest made by the federal government, even high-profile ones like Operation Cross Country." So what they found when they're going out and they're doing these things and they're collecting people that are in the sex trade, they're finding that for minors, the ages that they generally find are 16 and 17. That's where they're getting them. But they're not finding very many that are younger than that. Like there are some, but they're not finding. The majority of them are in the ages that this bill's amendments excluded, because they want to deal with the problem of minors being trafficked. Okay. So the information that we have now, it's not like when you dig in and you find these studies, you're going to find that the information isn't as like, it's not like there's tons of studies to go back and look and say, there's some studies out there and some of them are old and whatnot. So you have to work with the information that you got. And the information that we've got says that the study from Sacramento, the mean age was 20. Here we've got from 2014, they're saying, look, when we go out and we make bust, we're finding 16 and 17-year-olds. We're not really finding too many that are younger than that. It's mostly 16 and 17-year-olds. So then the question is, well, if we want to stop them, how do we prevent this, right? Because that's what the bill is trying to do. It's trying to prevent them. It's saying, like, look, we're going to go after the buyers. But the problem is they watered it down, and they watered down to the point where 16 and 17-year-olds are basically excluded. Like, they're still a misdemeanor. And as we see here in this article, it turns out that 16 and 17 is a very common age when authorities go out and they make bust. So right off the bat, the bill's kind of a waste at this point, right? Because it's not addressing the problem as we know it. But then let's go a little further. All right, so here's this article here. And so this is actually it's not an article, it's actually a study, and it was one of the ones linked in the Sacramento study. Vulnerabilities of female sex workers who enter the sex trade before the age of 18. And this is from 2020. So here's interesting out of the abstract. It said overall, 73% of women enter the sex trade to get drugs. 36% of women entered to get basic necessities, such as food or housing. And 17% of women entered to support their children or family. In other words, you've got a lot, like there's a huge number of women that are getting into the sex trade so they can pay for their drug habit. So it seems like if you want to deal with some prevention, rather than going after the buyer, maybe we need to start thinking about what are the circumstances that made somebody available to the buyer. Because, and I'm not suggesting like, hey, you go after the demand per se. What you do is you go after and you say, like, I'm sorry, the supplier, not the demand, the supplier, not the buyer, right? It's not like you're trying to go after the supplier necessarily, but maybe deal with the circumstances that makes them available in the first place. And then we go on and it says of significance, 21% of those aged under 18, less than 18 years of age at entry reported being either coerced, threatened, pressured, misled, tricked, or physically forced into the trading sex compared to 5% in those who entered at an older age group. So according to this study, what it's saying is those who are under the age of 18 got into the sex trade against their will. And those who are older got into it for other reasons. But the smallest reason was something related to against their will. Like that was the smallest reported reason. Okay. And then we see that drugs and necessities like food and housing. So basically, fueling a drug habit or trying to live. That's the problem that we've got here. So if they want to deal with this particular problem, which I think they should, number one, we as a society, we can have our laughs on social media and mock people and say, I knew it. Those LGBTQers, it's all, that's what they're all about. But we're doing a disservice if that's the extent of it. If that's as far as we go, then we are helping perpetuate the problem. And instead, we need to try and address the reasons that this problem exists. Now, I don't think that I don't think there's any kind of solution, whether it's a social one or whether it's a legal one, that will eliminate the sex trade. Sex work is one of the oldest professions in history. It's always been around, right? It will always be around for one reason or another. But what we can do when we're looking at legislation, and sometimes, the question is, do we need legislation or do we not? Well, in this particular case, according to what I just read, it seems like legislation may not really solve the problem because you're going to go after the buyer. And what they're trying to do is say, like, we're going to stop it before the action occurs, which is admirable. I get it. We should try to stop, we should try to stop people from buying children. And in my view, if you're 17 or younger, you're a child. I draw the line at 18. And I get it. There could be a 17-year-old that is much more mature than a 19-year-old. But at the end of the day, we have to draw the line somewhere. And so I say, since the majority of our society has drawn the line at things right at the age of 18, military service, that's when you can take out loans. That's when you can legally sign documents. That's when you can for sure get married in every single state, right? Like that's basically that line that we've already drawn. Okay. And so I say anybody under that line is considered a child. And it looks like that the problem is focused, we find that the problem is largest with 16 and 17-year-olds, but not so much for those under 15. So the watering down was not a good thing necessarily. But that doesn't mean that the bill itself was necessarily a good thing either, because it's only addressing the buyer, and it's making it's punishing people who are trying to go out and buy sex from somebody who's a minor, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't solve the original problem, which is, how did they get there in the first place? The original problem that got them there and that made them available in the first place were things like drug problems, were things like getting necessities, food, housing, those kind of things, supporting your child or your family in some way. So these are the problems that we really need to solve. And then when we do better at those problems, I don't think we'll ever solve them entirely, but when we do better, then you reduce the number of women, young women and women, who are available for the sex trade industry. Now, the other problem is a bit more challenging, because it said for those who are under 18, they reported being coerced, threatened, pressured, misled, tricked, or physically forced into the sex trade. So in other words, how do you stop that? Well, I think the social answer is to empower women. And I mean really empower women. I don't mean tell women not to get married, go get you a high-powered job, you be a CEO. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about empowering women in their day-to-day lives. Encourage women to take self-defense, encourage women to carry. Because guess what? A woman that carries, she's not going to be threatened necessarily. I mean, she might be, but she'll have the power to deal with it. Now, that gets a bit trickier when you're talking about, like, say, under the age of 18. But then again, is it really crazy to think that maybe a 16 or 17-year-old girl might want to carry some sort of weapon to defend herself? I don't think it's that crazy, especially if they're being forced into the sex trade and we want to prevent it. Well, what better way to prevent it than empowering someone to be able to prevent their situation from getting bad or getting worse, right? Like, hey, they've got a bad boyfriend. They haven't quite figured it out yet. But when they do, maybe they'll have the self-defense, or, in whatever, whether it's self-defense, learning actual self-defense or carrying or both, that they can say no. And that no can come back with the force to keep it a no. So this is why I do this, folks. I dig into these bills so that I can show you the arguments that we're having and the arguments that we're missing. And in this particular case, we've got 3 areas that we kind of went over. You've got the prevention, intervention, and then you got, I don't have a word for the last one, but after the fact, right? Like, what happens when they're out? And though all 3 of those require different strategies. And if we do better on the prevention, and we can do this in a way that doesn't require laws, then I would argue, when it's time to craft a law, as they said in the Reason article, we can more easily craft that to deal with circumstances appropriately. Because if you have, like, say, 10,000 women that are being trafficked, there's going to be any myriad of ways that are being trafficked. But if we change our society, if we improve our society such that instead of 10,000 being trafficked, or as it said, 13,000 between 2015 and 2020, all right. If instead of 13,000, that number was 3,000, well, the variations are, one, more easily understood. There'll probably be fewer variations, which means your laws can more easily deal with them. So this is the point. This is why I do bill reviews, so that we can understand the best approach to making a better society. And a better society comes with better understanding and knowledge. All right, folks. That's my show. Let's see. Let's take a look and see if there's any comments that I should address. Let's see. Here in Thailand, they give you almost automatically 10 plus years in Thai hell prison if you touch a minor under the age of 18. Doesn't sound so bad. Let's see what else we got here. Well, bye, and good luck with talking to a microphone alone. Oh, I see. I see what happened. Okay, look. Why go live if you don't interact or discuss with chat? Make a video instead. Okay, I was getting to it, okay? Like, I was trying to go through all this prepared material, folks. Like, cut me some slack. I go live and I try to interact with the comments, but I'm a one-man band here and I have to navigate all my windows and I have to navigate all my facts and have everything ordered in a way so that when I'm talking, it kind of makes sense. So cut me some slack, folks. Goodness, I tell you what, tough crowd around here. Tough crowd. All right. Folks, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you found it informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday mornings. Monday through Friday in the morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving a comment, or just blame me in the middle of the show because I didn't get to you fast enough. Apologies for that, folks. Remember, last but least, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.